The Fortune Hunter's Redemption. Chapter 1. The Hunt Begins. Bath, England, November 1816. Julian Hawkes stood before the mottled mirror in his cramped lodgings on Pulteney Street, adjusting his cravat with the precision of a man who understood that appearances were the only currency that truly mattered when one's coffers stood empty. The reflection that stared back at him was pleasing enough. Dark hair swept back from a high forehead, eyes the colour of aged whiskey, a mouth that could shape itself into almost any expression required. He had been told, on more than one occasion, that he resembled a gentleman of means rather than what he actually was, a fortune hunter of considerable skill, moderate conscience, and rapidly diminishing prospects. The room behind him contained a bed, a washstand, and a writing desk cluttered with letters he could no longer answer because he could no longer afford the postage. His boots, polished to a high shine despite their worn soles, stood ready by the door. His coat, brushed and pressed within an inch of its life, hung on a peg. Everything about Julian Hawkes suggested a man temporarily between fortunes, rather than one who had never possessed a fortune to begin with. He had been at this game for 5 years now, ever since his father's death had revealed that the Hawkes family estate, such as it was, existed in name only. The debts had consumed everything: the house in Surrey, the horses, the portrait gallery of ancestors who would have disowned him for what he had become. Julian sometimes wondered what they would think, those stiff-necked gentlemen in their gilded frames, of a son who made his living by making wealthy young women fall in love with him. He suspected they would have done the same had they possessed his looks and his desperation. The season in Bath was not London, but it served. The city teemed with eligible daughters, brought by ambitious mothers seeking the curative waters, and more importantly, advantageous matches. Julian had done well here last spring, coming within an inch of securing the hand of a cotton merchant's daughter before a rival had exposed his circumstances. He had retreated, regrouped, and now returned with a new name. He had been plain Julian Hawkes before. Now he styled himself Julian Hawksley, hinting at distant connections to a baronetcy that did not, in fact, exist, and renewed determination. His target this season was the Winslow family. He had learned of them through the usual channels: the gossip of innkeepers, the confidences of hairdressers, the careful observations of servants who could be persuaded to talk for the price of a drink. Mr. Percival Winslow was a banker of considerable wealth and even more considerable caution. He had made his fortune during the war, funding government contracts and emerging with his hands clean and his pockets full. His daughter, Miss Clara Winslow, was said to be his only child, his greatest pride, and the repository of all his hopes. The intelligence Julian had gathered suggested that Miss Winslow was quiet, bookish, and rarely seen in society. Some said she was plain, others said she was merely shy. Her father, it was rumoured, had refused 3 offers for her hand already, deeming the suitors unworthy of his daughter's portion. The portion itself was whispered to be enormous. Something in the neighbourhood of £30,000 settled absolutely upon her marriage. Julian had calculated the figures carefully. £30,000 would restore everything. It would buy back the Hawkes estate, pay off the remaining debts, and provide an income that would allow him to live as a gentleman ought to live. It would also, he told himself, allow him to provide for a wife in the manner to which she was accustomed. He would be a good husband, kind, attentive, faithful. He had never promised love to any of the women he had courted, and he did not intend to start now. But he could offer respect, comfort, and the appearance of affection. For many women of his acquaintance, that had been more than their own parents had given them. The clock on the mantel struck 11. Julian gave his cravat one final adjustment, shrugged into his coat, and descended the narrow stairs to the street. The November air carried the smell of coal smoke and the mineral tang of the famous waters. He turned his steps toward the pump room, where the Winslows were reliably reported to take their morning promenade at this hour. The pump room was crowded, as it always was at this time of year. Invalids sipped the warm, sulphurous water and made faces of theatrical distaste. Matrons gossiped in clusters, their eyes darting toward every new arrival. Young ladies walked slowly past the windows, pretending to admire the view while actually displaying themselves to best advantage. Julian moved through the crowd with the ease of long practice, nodding to acquaintances, raising his hat to ladies whose names he had forgotten, all while scanning the room for his prey. He found them near the far window, a tall, stern-faced man in sober black, and beside him a young woman in a gown of unadorned grey wool. Julian felt a moment of disappointment. He had hoped for prettiness, at least. What he saw instead was a figure so unobtrusive that she seemed almost to disappear against the pale stone of the wall behind her. Her hair was brown, pulled back severely beneath a plain bonnet. Her features were regular, but unremarkable. She held a book in her gloved hands and appeared to be reading it even as she walked, a habit that Julian considered either endearingly eccentric or dangerously absent-minded. But he had not come for beauty. He had come for £30,000. The difficulty, as he had learned from long experience, lay in approaching a banker's daughter without appearing to know that her father was a banker. Mr. Winslow would be suspicious of any young man who showed too much interest in his only child. The approach must be indirect, the interest apparently accidental, the entire enterprise conducted with the delicacy of a surgeon performing a particularly tricky operation. Julian positioned himself near the bookshop that occupied one corner of the pump room, pretending to study the volumes displayed in the window. From this vantage point, he could observe the Winslows without appearing to do so. Mr. Winslow walked with his hands clasped behind his back, his expression suggesting that he found the entire proceedings beneath his notice. His daughter matched his pace exactly, her eyes still fixed on her book. They passed within 3 feet of Julian. He caught a whiff of lavender soap and paper, the smell of libraries, of study, of a life lived largely indoors. The girl did not look up. Her father did not look at him. They continued their circuit of the room, oblivious to the fortune hunter in their midst. Julian felt a flicker of something that might have been irritation. He was accustomed to being noticed. He had been told, repeatedly, and by women who should have known better, that he was the handsomest man in any room he entered. Yet this girl, this banker's daughter with her dowdy gown and her relentless book, had not even glanced his way. He would have to work harder than he had anticipated. The opportunity came 3 days later, in the lending library on Milsom Street. Julian had followed the Winslows there, having learned from a talkative maid that Miss Winslow visited the library every Tuesday and Friday without fail. He had positioned himself in the fiction section, a volume of Mrs. Radcliffe in his hand, and waited. She entered at precisely 11 o'clock, alone for once, her father having apparently trusted her to make her own way home. Julian watched her move through the shelves, her fingers trailing over the spines, her lips moving slightly as she read titles to herself. She was not, he observed, entirely without grace. There was something almost pretty in the concentration of her features, in the way she bit her lower lip when she encountered a book that interested her. He waited until she had selected a volume and turned toward the lending desk. Then he stepped into her path. "I beg your pardon," he said, executing a slight bow. "I did not see you there." She looked up at him, and for the first time Julian saw her eyes clearly. They were grey, not the pale grey of winter skies, but a darker shade, the colour of slate just after rain. And they were looking at him with an expression that he could not quite read. Wariness, perhaps, interest, possibly, but not the flutter of immediate attraction that he was accustomed to inspiring. "I beg your pardon," she replied. "I was not looking where I was going." Her voice was low and pleasant, with none of the girlish breathlessness that Julian associated with young ladies of marriageable age. She spoke as one who was accustomed to being listened to, or at least to expecting it. Julian smiled, his most charming smile, the one that had melted hearts from London to Brighton. You were reading, he said, nodding toward the book in her hand. I hope I did not interrupt anything too engrossing. She glanced down at the volume as if she had forgotten she was holding it. It is only Miss Austen, she said. I have read it before. Ah, Miss Austen. Julian endeavoured to look knowledgeable. I am told she is all the rage. She is rather more than that. The grey eyes studied him with an attention that was slightly unnerving. But perhaps you prefer Mrs. Radcliffe. She nodded toward the book in his own hand. Julian looked down at the mysteries of Udolpho and felt a moment's panic. He had chosen it at random, judging by its thickness that it would appear suitably impressive. He had not, in fact, read a word of it. A passing interest only, he said smoothly. I find myself more drawn to works of practical philosophy. How interesting. Her tone gave nothing away. And which philosophers do you favour? This was dangerous ground. Julian's education had been adequate but not extensive. He knew the names, certainly, but the contents were another matter entirely. Adam Smith, primarily, he said, seizing on the one philosopher he could reliably associate with her father's profession. His work on moral sentiments is most instructive. Something flickered in those grey eyes, amusement, perhaps, or suspicion. Indeed. And do you find his theories applicable to modern life? Most assuredly. Julian warmed to his theme. The concept of the impartial spectator, for instance, the idea that we should conduct ourselves as if observed by a disinterested third party. It has guided my actions for many years. It was a lie, of course. Julian's actions were guided by entirely different considerations, but it sounded well, and that was what mattered. I see. She was quiet for a moment, and Julian thought he had succeeded. Then she said, except that Smith's impartial spectator is not disinterested at all. He is, in fact, deeply interested. It is conscience itself, the internalized judgment of society. To call him disinterested is to misunderstand the entire premise. Julian felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He had been corrected, and by a woman. Worse, he had been corrected accurately, though he had only the vaguest notion of what she was talking about. You are clearly better read than I, he said, retreating into self-deprecation. I stand corrected. She regarded him for a long moment. Do you? She asked. Stand corrected, I mean. Or do you merely say so? It was such an unexpected question that Julian laughed, a genuine laugh, not the practiced chuckle he employed in drawing rooms. You are very direct, Miss Winslow. She did not offer her first name. Clara Winslow. Julian Hawksley. He bowed again, more deeply this time. And I assure you, Miss Winslow, that when I admit myself mistaken, I mean it. It is a luxury I can afford only rarely, but I recognize its value when I can. She smiled then, just slightly, and Julian saw that she might indeed be pretty when she chose to be. A diplomatic answer. My father would approve. Your father is Mr. Percival Winslow, the banker? If she noticed that he knew this already, she gave no sign. The same, but I collect that you already knew that. Julian felt another flicker of unease. This was not proceeding according to plan. The heiresses he had courted in the past had been flattered by his attention, eager to believe the best of him, willing to overlook small inconsistencies in his story. This one seemed to notice everything. I confess I had heard the name, he said carefully. Bath is a small city, and your father is a man of some prominence. He is. She looked at him again, and Julian had the uncomfortable sensation that she was adding up sums in her head, sums that involved him and that were not coming out in his favour. Well, Mr. Hawksley, it has been a pleasure to meet a fellow admirer of Adam Smith, however imperfect your recollection of his theories may be. I hope we shall meet again. She moved past him toward the lending desk, leaving Julian standing among the novels with Mrs. Radcliffe still clutched in his hand. He watched her go, trying to decide whether he had succeeded or failed. She had spoken to him, certainly. She had given him her name, but she had not, as far as he could tell, been charmed. If anything, she had been assessing him, evaluating him, and he was not entirely certain what conclusion she had reached. It was a new experience for Julian Hawkes, and he did not care for it. Chapter 2. The Calculation. Clara Winslow sat at her father's desk in the study of their rented house on Royal Crescent, a stack of account books open before her and a column of figures marching down the page in her neat, precise hand. Outside, the November fog had settled over Bath like a blanket, muffling the sounds of carriage wheels and footfalls until the world seemed to consist only of this room, this desk, these numbers that made their own kind of sense. She had been adding sums since she was old enough to hold a pencil. Her father, who had wanted a son to carry on his business, had instead made do with a daughter who possessed, as he sometimes said, a head for figures that would shame a counting-house clerk. From the age of 12, Clara had helped him with his accounts, checking his calculations, spotting errors, learning to read the story that numbers told about a person's life. The story they told about Mr. Julian Hawksley was, she suspected, not a happy one. She had not meant to investigate him. It was simply a habit. When someone new entered her orbit, she collected information. The lending library had provided a starting point. Mr. Hawksley had taken out a subscription 3 weeks ago, choosing primarily novels and volumes of poetry, not, she noted, works of practical philosophy. His conversation about Adam Smith had been, at best, a performance. The assembly rooms had provided more. Mrs. Armistead, who noticed everything and forgot nothing, had mentioned that the handsome Mr. Hawksley lodged on Pulteney Street in rooms that were, she had heard, respectable but modest. The maid at the White Hart had been more forthcoming. Mr. Hawksley dined there occasionally, always alone, always on the cheapest items on the menu. He tipped adequately but not generously. He received few letters and sent fewer. The picture that emerged was of a man living on the edge of respectability, maintaining appearances with nothing behind them. It was a picture Clara recognized because she saw similar ones every day in her father's ledgers. Men who borrowed against expectations, who spent what they did not have, who built their lives on credit and hoped that something would turn up before the reckoning came. What she did not yet know was whether Julian Hawksley was one of those desperate men or something worse. He appeared again 3 days later, at a concert in the upper rooms. Clara saw him the moment he entered. It was impossible not to, for he moved through a crowd with the ease of a man who expected to be watched. His evening clothes were not new, she noted, but they were well cared for, and he wore them as if they cost a great deal more than they probably had. He made his way toward her, stopping to speak to various acquaintances along the route, and Clara found herself watching his progress with an interest that was not entirely analytical. There was something about him, a vitality, a sense that he was fully present in a way that most people were not. When he finally reached her side, she realized that she had been holding her breath. "Miss Winslow." He bowed over her hand, his lips stopping just short of her glove. "What a pleasure to find you here." "Mr. Hawksley." She withdrew her hand perhaps more quickly than was strictly polite. "I did not know you cared for music." "I care for it very much, when the company is agreeable." He smiled, and Clara saw why women were said to lose their heads over him. The smile transformed his face, lighting his eyes and softening the sharp lines of his jaw. It was a dangerous smile, and she was not immune to it. "Then I hope the music will not disappoint you," she said, refusing to acknowledge that she might be the agreeable company in question. "The soprano tonight is said to be excellent." They stood together through the first set of songs, and Clara found herself oddly aware of his presence beside her, the warmth of him, the scent of soap and starch, the way his shoulder almost, but not quite, brushed against hers. When the interval came, he turned to her with an expression of polite inquiry. Might I fetch you some refreshment, Miss Winslow? A glass of lemonade, perhaps? Thank you, no. I am perfectly comfortable. He did not move away. Instead, he lowered his voice and said, I wonder if I might ask your advice on a matter of some delicacy. Clara felt her pulse quicken. My advice? I am flattered, but I cannot imagine what advice I could possibly give you. It concerns books, he smiled again, and this time there was something almost sheepish in it. After our conversation at the library, I reflected that my reading has been, shall we say, insufficiently rigorous. I find myself desiring to improve my mind, but I hardly know where to begin. You struck me as someone who might have useful suggestions. It was such an unexpected request that Clara laughed, a genuine laugh, not the polite titter that society required. You wish me to recommend books to you? I do, if you would be so kind. She studied him for a long moment, trying to read what lay behind the request. Was it merely another stratagem to remain in her company? Or was there something genuine in it? I could recommend books, she said slowly. But I should warn you, my taste runs to the serious. I am not one for novels, for the most part. I should expect nothing less. His voice was earnest, but his eyes held a gleam of something that might have been amusement. I have already sampled the novels. It is time for something more substantial. Very well. Clara found herself warming to the challenge. If you are serious in your intentions, you might begin with Locke's essay concerning human understanding. It is the foundation of so much that has followed. Julian's expression flickered. Alarm, perhaps, or dismay. Locke? Yes, I have heard of him, of course. Have you read him? I cannot say that I have. Then you have a great pleasure ahead of you. Clara smiled, and this time she meant it. Shall I lend you my copy? I have it at home. You would do that? He looked genuinely surprised. You would trust me with your book? I would trust you to return it. Reading it is another matter entirely. She paused, then added, Besides, if you do not return it, I shall know where to find you. It was a warning, lightly delivered, and she saw that he understood it as such. Something passed between them then, an acknowledgement, perhaps, that they were both engaged in some kind of game, though neither had yet named the stakes. The following week, Clara received a note requesting the loan of the lock, which she duly sent round to his lodgings with a footman. 3 days later, another note arrived, this one containing a surprisingly coherent summary of the first 2 chapters and a request for the next volume. She sent it, and then another, and another. The notes continued, observations on Locke, questions about Hume, speculations about Kant. Some of them were clearly the product of genuine engagement with the texts. Others seemed designed merely to maintain the correspondence. But Clara found herself looking forward to them, found herself composing her replies with more care than the subject strictly warranted, found herself thinking about Julian Hawksley at odd moments during the day. This was dangerous. She knew it was dangerous, but she could not quite bring herself to stop. Her father noticed, of course. Percival Winslow noticed everything that concerned his daughter. This young man, he said one evening, looking up from his newspaper. Hawksley, the one who keeps sending you notes. Clara felt her cheeks warm. He is not sending me notes, Papa. He is borrowing books. Borrowing books. Her father's tone was dry. A new approach, I suppose. I have heard of men courting with flowers and poetry, but never with philosophy. It is not courting. Clara spoke more sharply than she intended. It is simply conversation. He wishes to improve himself. And he has chosen you as his tutor. Her father folded his newspaper and regarded her with an expression she knew well, the look he wore when he was about to say something she did not wish to hear. My dear, I have made inquiries about this Mr. Hawksley, or Hawks, as he appears to be called in certain circles. Clara's stomach tightened. What kind of inquiries? The kind any father makes when a young man shows interest in his only daughter. He paused, choosing his words carefully. The picture that emerges is not entirely reassuring. The gentleman appears to have no visible means of support. He has been seen in London, Brighton, and now Bath, always in the company of eligible young women. There is talk, only talk, mind you, that he has been asked to leave more than one neighbourhood when his circumstances became known. Clara had known this. In some corner of her mind, she had known it from the beginning, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that her own suspicions had not. He has not courted me, Papa. He has only borrowed books. And yet he seeks you out at every opportunity. He writes to you daily. He positions himself wherever you are likely to appear. Her father's voice was gentle but implacable. My dear, I have been in business long enough to recognize a man who is calculating his chances. I do not say he means you harm, only that he means you something, and that something is likely connected to your fortune. Clara sat very still, her hands clasped in her lap. The fire crackled in the grate, and outside the fog continued to press against the windows. What would you have me do? She asked. Nothing, for now. Continue as you have been. But keep your eyes open, my dear, and your heart, if you can manage it. He reached across and took her hand. You are cleverer than most young women, Clara, cleverer than most men for that matter. Use that cleverness. Look at him the way you look at a set of accounts. See what the numbers really say. The numbers. Yes. Clara understood numbers. The next afternoon, she sent a note to Julian requesting his company for a walk in the Sydney Gardens. It was a bold move, unprecedented in their acquaintance, but she had made a decision. If he was a fortune hunter, she would know it. And if he was something else, something more complicated, she would know that too. He was waiting for her at the appointed hour, his greatcoat buttoned against the cold, his hat in his hand. When he saw her approaching, his face lit with a smile that seemed entirely genuine. Miss Winslow, this is an unexpected pleasure. Is it? She fell into step beside him, matching her pace to his longer stride. I thought it was time we spoke plainly, Mr. Hawksley. Or should I call you Mr. Hawkes? He stopped walking. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, and Clara watched the expressions chase across his face. Surprise, calculation, something that might have been respect. You have been making inquiries, he said. I have. My father has been making inquiries. We are, as you may have gathered, a family that believes in knowing the facts. And what facts have you discovered? Clara told him. She recited the dates, the places, the names of the young women he had courted and left. She did not do it cruelly. She was not a cruel person, but she did it completely, leaving nothing out. When she finished, Julian was silent for a long time. They had resumed walking, and their feet crunched on the gravel path. The gardens were nearly empty in the November chill, and the bare branches of the trees traced black lines against the grey sky. Everything you say is true, he said at last. Or nearly everything. I have not, as the rumours suggest, been asked to leave any neighbourhood. I have always left of my own accord, when it became clear that my suit would not succeed. He paused. But I have courted women for their fortunes. I will not deny it. I have nothing else to offer. Nothing? He laughed, a sound with no humour in it. I have a name that is not entirely my own, a wardrobe that is held together by hope and good tailoring, and a set of debts that grow larger every day. I have charm, Miss Winslow. I know that because women have told me so. I have a face that people trust, and I have a desperate determination not to end my days in a debtor's prison, watching my few remaining possessions sold to pay what I owe. Claire walked on, considering this. And my fortune would solve all of that. Your fortune would solve all of that. He met her eyes. I will not lie to you and say I have not thought of it. I have thought of little else since I first saw you in the pump room. Then why tell me the truth now? Why not continue the pretense? You corrected me about Adam Smith. I found that I was wrong. Because you are not like the others. Because when you corrected me about Adam Smith, I found myself wanting to actually read him, just to see if you were right. Because I have spent the past fortnight struggling through Locke and Hume and Kant, not because I thought it would impress you, but because I wanted to understand what you saw in them. He stopped walking and turned to face her. Because you are the first person in years who has made me want to be something other than what I am. Clara looked at him, at his handsome face, at the shadows under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, at the slight tremor in the hands that held his hat. She thought of her father's ledgers, of the story the numbers told about this man, debts, desperation, a future that narrowed to a single point, marry money or fail. But she also thought of the notes he had sent her, the genuine curiosity in some of them, the way he wrestled with ideas that were clearly new to him, the flashes of humour and intelligence that had nothing to do with fortune hunting. She thought of the way he looked at her, not as a prize to be won, but as a person to be understood. You should know, she said quietly, that my fortune is not what you think. He frowned. What do you mean? I mean that it is not mine, not yet, and perhaps not ever. She drew a breath and told him what she had never told any suitor. My father is a banker, yes. He has money, but he also has principles. The fortune he has accumulated is his, to do with as he wishes. And what he wishes is to see me married to a man who can demonstrate financial probity and sound judgment, not a man who needs my money, but a man who does not need it at all. Julian stared at her. Then the £30,000 is a possibility, not a certainty. My father has made clear that any husband of mine must prove himself worthy of my hand before a penny is settled. He will not buy me a husband, Mr. Hawkes. He will not even rent one. The colour drained from Julian's face. Clara watched him calculate, saw the moment when he realised that all his efforts, all his careful planning, had been built on sand. Then I have been pursuing a phantom, he said. You have been pursuing me. Clara corrected him gently. The fortune was always secondary, whether you knew it or not. He looked at her, and something shifted in his expression, a recognition, perhaps, that she was not the naive heiress he had imagined. And now that you know what I am, what I have done, now I know what you have been. She held his gaze. What you are remains to be seen. Chapter 3. The Reckoning. Julian did not sleep that night. He lay in his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, while the clock on the mantel ticked away the hours, and his thoughts circled like wolves. She knew. She had known all along, or guessed enough to make the truth inevitable. And instead of dismissing him, instead of laughing in his face and walking away, she had offered him something he had not dared to hope for. A chance. But a chance at what? To prove himself worthy of a woman whose fortune was not even certain. To demonstrate financial probity when he could not pay his own rent. To become the kind of man who deserved Clara Winslow when he had spent his entire adult life becoming the kind of man who did not. He thought about running. It would be easy enough. Pack his few possessions, slip out of Bath before dawn, find another town, another heiress, another chance. There were always more heiresses. There were always more chances. But the thought brought no relief. Only a weary sense of repetition, of a road he had travelled too many times already. In the morning, he wrote to Clara asking if he might call on her father. The interview took place in Mr. Winslow's study, a room lined with leather-bound ledgers and smelling of paper and ink. Clara was not present. This was, as her father made clear, a conversation between men, and she would hear the results soon enough. Julian had prepared himself for many things, for suspicion, for hostility, for the cold dismissal of a man who had seen fortune hunters before. What he had not prepared for was the quiet attention with which Mr. Winslow regarded him, the way those shrewd eyes seemed to see straight through to the frightened boy beneath the charming surface. "So," Mr. Winslow said, when Julian had finished his account, the true account this time, with nothing left out. "You have debts, no prospects, a talent for making women like you, and you wish to marry my daughter." "I wish to prove myself worthy of your daughter." Julian met his gaze steadily. "I know I'm not worthy now. I know I have nothing to offer her, but the possibility of becoming something better." "The possibility." Mr. Winslow leaned back in his chair. "That is a thin offering, Mr. Hawkes. The possibility of bread does not feed a hungry man." "No, but it might give him reason to keep walking toward the baker." A long silence. Then, unexpectedly, Mr. Winslow laughed. "That is not a bad answer. Not a good one, mind you, but not bad." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the fog-shrouded crescent. "My daughter tells me you have been reading philosophy at her suggestion." "I have. Locke, Hume, Kant. I cannot claim to understand them all, but I have tried." "And what have you learned?" Julian considered the question carefully. "I have learned that I know less than I thought I did, that the world is more complicated than it appears, that there are questions worth asking even when they have no answers." He paused. "I have learned that I like knowing things, that I like understanding them, that for the first time in years I want something other than money." Mr. Winslow turned to face him. "And what do you want?" "You know what I want." Julian's voice was steady, though his heart hammered in his chest. "I want your daughter, but I want to deserve her first." Another long silence. Then Mr. Winslow walked back to his desk, sat down, and pulled a sheet of paper toward him. "I am going to make you an offer," he said. "It is not the offer you were hoping for, but it is the only offer you will receive." He wrote for a few minutes, then pushed the paper across the desk. Julian picked it up and read. It was a proposal for a partnership, not in marriage, but in commerce. Mr. Winslow had recently acquired a small bank in Bristol, one that had fallen on hard times and required careful management to restore to profitability. He needed a man on the ground, someone to oversee the daily operations, to rebuild trust with depositors, to learn the business from the inside. The position paid a modest salary, enough to live on, barely, and offered no guarantees. If Julian succeeded, there might be more. If he failed, there would be nothing. "You want me to be a banker," Julian said slowly. "I want you to learn to be a banker. There is a difference." Mr. Winslow's expression was unreadable. "You have charm, Mr. Hawkes. You have the ability to make people trust you. Those are useful qualities in a banker, properly applied. What you lack is substance, the knowledge, the judgment, the experience that turns charm into credibility. I am offering you the chance to acquire those things." Julian read the document again, trying to absorb its implications. It was not what he had imagined. It was not what he had hoped for. It was, in fact, the opposite of everything he had spent years trying to achieve: work, discipline, the slow accumulation of respectability rather than the quick acquisition of wealth. But it was also, he realized, a kind of redemption, a chance to become the man he had pretended to be. "Clara," he said, "what does she think of this?" "She thinks you should accept." Mr. Winslow permitted himself a small smile. "She also thinks you should know that she will wait. Not forever, she is too sensible for forever, but for a reasonable time, a year, perhaps 2, long enough for you to prove yourself or to fail trying. A year, 2 years. It stretched before Julian like an ocean, vast and terrifying. He had never sustained anything for 2 years, not a job, not a relationship, not even a consistent story about who he was. He had always moved on when things became difficult, always chosen the easier path, always told himself that the next chance would be better than this one. But there was no next chance. He knew that, with a certainty that settled into his bones like cold. If he walked away from this, he walked away from Clara. And the thought of walking away from her was worse than the thought of staying. "I accept," he said. Mr. Winslow nodded, as if he had expected nothing less. "Then we have much to discuss. Sit down, Mr. Hawkes. We have work to do." The weeks that followed were the hardest of Julian's life. Bristol was not Bath. It was a working city, a port city, a place where ships unloaded cargoes from the West Indies, and the counting houses hummed with the business of empire. The bank Mr. Winslow had acquired was a small concern on a narrow street near the harbour, its windows grimy with salt spray and its ledgers filled with loans that would never be repaid. Julian arrived on a grey December morning, his few possessions in a battered portmanteau, and stood outside the bank for a long moment before summoning the courage to enter. Inside, he found chaos. Papers everywhere, clerks who looked at him with suspicion, customers who came to demand money the bank did not have. The manager, a harassed man named Thompson, had been expecting him and made no effort to hide his resentment at this young pup sent from Bath to oversee his work. "Mr. Winslow's man," he said, with something between a sneer and a sigh. "Come to show us how it's done, have you?" "I've come to learn how it's done," Julian said, "if you'll teach me." Thompson looked at him for a long moment, then shrugged. "Suit yourself. There's a desk in the corner. Try not to get in the way." That first week, Julian did little but watch. He watched Thompson deal with customers, watched the clerks post entries in the ledgers, watched the daily ritual of counting coin and balancing books. He asked questions, endless questions, until the clerks groaned when they saw him coming. He read old accounts, trying to understand how the bank had fallen into its current state. He walked the streets of Bristol, introducing himself to merchants and shopkeepers, learning their names and their businesses and their concerns. It was exhausting. It was humbling. It was, in ways he had not anticipated, deeply satisfying. At night, he wrote to Clara. Long letters, full of observations and questions and confessions. He told her about his failures, the loan he had misjudged, the customer he had offended, the moment when Thompson had lost patience and shouted at him in front of everyone. He told her about his small successes, the merchant who had deposited his funds after a conversation, the account he had reconciled after hours of work, the first time Thompson had nodded in grudging approval. And she wrote back. Her letters were shorter than his, more measured, but they were full of the same quiet intelligence he had admired from the beginning. She asked questions that made him think. She offered observations that illuminated things he had not seen. She did not promise to love him, or to wait forever, or to overlook his past. But she did promise to read his letters, to consider his progress, to keep a place in her thoughts for the man he was trying to become. By spring, Julian had begun to understand the bank's problems. Too many bad loans, too little oversight, too much trust in customers who did not deserve it. He presented a report to Mr. Winslow, outlining a plan for recovery. Call in the worst debts, write off those that could never be recovered. Focus on building relationships with solid local businesses, rather than chasing speculative ventures. Mr. Winslow read it in silence, then looked up with an expression Julian could not read. "This is good work," he said. "Surprisingly good." "I had a good teacher." Julian hesitated, then added, "Several good teachers." "Thompson speaks well of you, says you've applied yourself." Mr. Winslow set the report aside. "Clara speaks well of you too, says your letters show genuine growth." Julian felt his heart quicken. "How is she?" "Well, busy, reading too much as always." A pause. "She asks about you constantly, tries to pretend she doesn't, but she does." The summer passed, and then autumn. Julian's salary increased slightly, his responsibilities grew, his understanding of banking deepened until he could speak knowledgeably about interest rates and commercial paper and the complex dance of credit that kept the mercantile world turning. He no longer thought about fortune hunting, except as a shameful memory of a person he had once been. He thought instead about Clara, about her grey eyes and her quiet voice, and the way she had seen through him from the very beginning. In November, almost exactly a year after their walk in the Sydney Gardens, Julian received a letter that made his hands tremble. Dear Julian, Papa tells me that the Bristol Bank is now profitable. He tells me that you have been offered a junior partnership, with a share of the profits and a voice in the management. He tells me that Thompson, who was so suspicious of you at first, now calls you the best colleague he has ever had. I tell you these things not because you do not know them, but because I want you to know that I know them. I have followed your progress with great interest, greater interest perhaps than I should admit. And I have reached a conclusion. I would like to see you again. Not as a fortune hunter and an heiress, not as a supplicant and a judge, but simply as two people who might perhaps have something to offer one another. If you are willing, I will come to Bristol next week. We can walk by the harbour, if the weather permits, and you can show me the bank you have saved and the life you have built. If you are not willing, if the past year has changed your feelings, or if you have found someone else, or if you simply wish to be left alone, then I will understand. But I hope you are willing. I find that I have missed you, Julian Hawkes. I find that I have missed you very much. Yours, with hope, Clara. Julian read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in his pocket, over his heart. Chapter 4. The Fortune Found. As she descended from the carriage with the same quiet composure he remembered. She wore a blue wool travelling dress and a bonnet that framed her face without quite hiding it, and when she saw him waiting, she smiled. It was not the smile of an heiress assessing a suitor's prospects. It was simply a smile, warm and genuine, and Julian felt something shift in his chest that had been locked tight for a very long time. Miss Winslow. He bowed, formal, despite everything. You are very welcome. Mr. Hawkes. She inclined her head, but her eyes were dancing. Or should I call you Mr. Hawksley? I confess I am never quite certain. Julian, I hope. He offered his arm. After everything, I think we may safely dispense with formality. She took his arm, and they walked together through the streets of Bristol toward the harbour. The city was busy, carts rattling over cobblestones, sailors shouting, merchants calling out their wares, but Clara seemed not to notice. She was looking at him. You look well, she said. Different, better. I feel different. He paused, searching for words. I feel as though I have been asleep for years and only just woken up. Does that make sense? More sense than you might think. She was quiet for a moment. Papa says you have done remarkable work with the bank, that you have a natural talent for understanding what people need and for convincing them to trust you. The same talents that made me a fortune hunter, Julian said ruefully, turned to better purposes. Exactly. She squeezed his arm slightly. That is what redemption means, I think. Not becoming someone new, but becoming who you might have been all along if circumstances had been different. They reached the harbour and stood looking out at the water. Ships rocked at anchor, their masts swaying gently against the bright sky. Gulls cried and wheeled overhead. The air smelled of salt and tar and distant places. I have something to show you, Julian said, if you are willing. He led her to the bank, a short walk from the harbour, on the street where the merchants did business. The windows were clean now, the brass fittings polished, the sign freshly painted. Inside, clerks bent over ledgers, and customers waited in an orderly line. Thompson emerged from his office and nodded to Julian with something approaching respect. "Your young lady?" he asked, glancing at Clara. "Yes, this is Miss Winslow." Julian felt a foolish pride in saying it. "Mr. Thompson, my colleague." They exchanged pleasantries, and then Julian led Clara to his own office, a small room at the back with a desk piled high with papers and a window that looked out onto a narrow courtyard. It was not much, but it was his. "This is where the magic happens," he said, with a self-deprecating smile. "Or the drudgery, depending on the day." Clara moved slowly around the room, looking at everything, the ledgers, the correspondence, the small portrait of her father that Julian had hung on the wall. When she turned back to him, her eyes were bright. "You did this," she said. "You built this." "I had help. Your father, Thompson, the clerks who taught me more than they know." He hesitated. "You. Your letters kept me going when I wanted to give up." She was very close now, close enough that he could see the flecks of silver in her grey eyes, the slight tremble of her lips. "Julian." She said his name softly, as if testing it. "I have thought about this moment for a very long time. About what I would say, what I would feel. And now that it is here, I find that I do not know how to say any of it." "Then don't say it." He reached out and took her hands. They were cold, despite her gloves, and he chafed them gently between his own. "Let me say something instead. Something I should have said a year ago when we walked in the Sydney Gardens." She waited, her eyes on his face. "I love you," Julian said. "I think I loved you from the moment you corrected me about Adam Smith, though I did not know it then. I love your mind, your honesty, your refusal to be fooled by anyone, especially me. I love that you saw through me and did not turn away. I love that you gave me a chance to become someone worth loving." He drew a breath. "I have nothing to offer you but myself, no fortune, no title, no grand estate, but I have a business that is growing, a reputation that is solid, and a heart that belongs entirely to you. If that is enough, I would be the happiest of men. If it is not, it is enough." Her voice was steady, but her eyes glistened. "It is more than enough. It is everything." She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, and Julian thought his heart might burst with the wonder of it. Then she kissed him, a gentle kiss, a promise, and he understood that this was what he had been seeking all along, through all those years of chasing fortunes and courting heiresses. Not money, not security, not the appearance of respectability. Just this. One person, seeing him clearly and choosing him anyway. They were married in the spring, in the old church at Bath where Clara had been christened. It was a small wedding, only family and a few close friends, but it felt complete to Julian in a way that no grand society affair could have matched. Mr. Winslow gave his daughter away with tears in his eyes and a handshake for his new son that spoke louder than words. Thompson came down from Bristol and got slightly drunk at the wedding breakfast, making speeches about Julian that embarrassed everyone but pleased them all. The fortune that Julian had once sought, the £30,000 that had seemed so essential to his plans, never materialised. Mr. Winslow settled a modest sum on his daughter, enough for comfort but not for idleness, and made clear that Julian would be expected to earn his own way, which he did, gladly, building the Bristol Bank into a thriving concern and eventually opening a second branch in Bath, closer to Clara's family. They had 3 children over the years, 2 daughters and a son, and Julian taught them all to read before they were 5, just as Clara insisted. On summer evenings, they would walk together in the Sydney Gardens, the children running ahead, and Julian would marvel at the life he had somehow stumbled into. "Do you ever think about it?" Clara asked him once, as they watched the sunset stain the sky gold and rose. "About what you might have become?" "Every day." He put his arm around her, drawing her close. "Every day I think about the man I was, and thank God for the woman who saved me from him." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "You saved yourself, Julian. I only pointed the way." "Then we saved each other." He kissed her hair. "That is the best kind of fortune, I think. The kind you find together." The children called to them from the path ahead, impatient to continue the walk, and they went forward together into the golden evening, leaving behind the ghosts of who they had been, and embracing, at last, who they had become. The end. My dear and gentle listeners, thus concludes our tale for tonight. If you have walked these winding paths of devotion and doubt with us, if you have felt the hush of candlelit confessions and the tremor of guarded hearts at last laid bare, then you have my most sincere gratitude. It is no small thing to lend one's time and tender attention to a story. In an age as hurried as our own, such constancy is a rare and admirable virtue. I thank you for it most warmly. Should you wish to remain in our company, to wander further through moonlit gardens, stand witness to proud dukes undone, steadfast heroines revealed, and love that triumphs over pride and peril alike, I entreat you to subscribe and join our growing circle. By subscribing, you ensure that no whispered scandal, no long-buried secret, and no long-awaited declaration of the heart shall pass you by. Until we meet again beneath the soft glow of chandeliers and the turning of carriage wheels, I remain, as ever, your devoted storyteller.